coming to you from the EDP offices in the heart of Norwich, and this is the second of our election programmes, our special election programmes, where we're meeting the candidates in Norwich. This time we're meeting the candidates in Norwich South, and I'm here with an audience of voters, and I'm hoping you're going to get involved as well on Facebook or on Twitter. We're at Muster this week if you want to put your questions to the panel. So, the panel this evening, they are from the Labour Party, Clive Lewis; from the Liberal Democrats, we have James Wright; from the Conservatives, Lana Hempsall; and from the Green Party, Richard Bearman. So welcome to you all. So let's kick off straight away with a question from the audience, and Muster TV's Rob Setchell has the microphone, and he's going to introduce our first question.
Yes, we've got a first question from Valerie. Front row, Valerie. Take it away.
Thank you.
But not without the microphone, which is appearing now.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity of doing this. Theresa May has reportedly told Donald Trump that she is disappointed that he has withdrawn the USA from the Paris Climate Agreement. If you were Prime Minister of our country, what would you have said to Donald Trump?
All right, thank you very much, Valerie. Let's start with the Conservative candidate, Lana Hempsall.
Go on, Lana.
What would you have said to Donald Trump this morning?
If I was the Prime Minister,
Yes.
I would tell him that he should probably sleep on that decision and look at it again in the morning, because it's a great loss to lose the United States out of the Paris Agreement.
Was she strong enough? She didn't sign the letter from France and Italy and Germany condemning the move. Was that the right decision?
I suspect that Theresa May, in her wisdom, knows Donald Trump far better than I do, and I suspect she has her reasons for doing that, there must be something else that she's waiting for from him.
Okay. Let's go to Richard Bearman from the Green
definitely.
Party.
I'll say one thing for Donald Trump. He's got the environment on the agenda for this election, which nobody else has managed up to this point, but we're still trying. Disappointed, appalled, devastated, very disappointed would have helped. Anything better than just disappointed. I mean, it's an appalling approach to take an agreement which was thrashed out after so many years and so much effort with so many countries and just say, I don't want anything to do with this. It's a completely irresponsible attitude to the people who got the work done in the first place. It's an irresponsible attitude to the climate of this planet. And I go back as far as Rio 1972, where the whole concept was think global, act local. So we've still got to do our bit about tackling climate change and tackling issues in this country and other countries, and I'm really pleased to see other world leaders are not bowing down to this attitude from Donald Trump. If it isn't good for my country, I'm not going to do it. So insularist and isolationist, we don't want anything to do with it.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's ask Clive Lewis. So the question was, if you were Prime Minister, what would you have said to him?
Well, disappointed is what you say to your child when they haven't done their homework. This is an existential crisis for our planet, for humanity, for the world. I think Donald Trump has been spineless, and it's weak, and he's not showing leadership. And I don't think Theresa May is showing the kind of leadership that I think that most of the people in this country would like to see, which is to stand up to Donald Trump and say, yes, look, we are historically your allies, but you're out of line here. You need to understand that the Europeans, the Chinese, and many other countries across the world will carry on with this. We will not stand back just because you have. So I think she needed to take a far more robust approach. She hasn't, and that's to our shame, I think.
Okay, James Wright, what would you have said if you were on the phone to Donald Trump?
Well, I think one of the things that Theresa May has been banking on in a post-Brexit world is we've got this special relationship with Donald Trump, and I really think she should have used that special relationship with Trump and then told him exactly how we feel about it. It is clearly a regressive step on the part of Trump. He's pandering to his own coal industry, I think, in more sense than not. So really, Theresa May should have used that special relationship, been the critical friend, and told Trump exactly why he was wrong over this.
All right, let's give Lana an opportunity. Do you want to come back on that? I mean, could she have done more?
I'm not going to comment any further. I mean, honestly, Theresa May will probably know Donald Trump far better than any of us here in this room, and if she's taken a stance that she has, she must have good reason for that. So.
Okay, all right. Thank you all very much. Let's go to Rob for another question.
Yeah, let's move subjects then. We've got a question here from Des Fulcher in the audience. Des.
Thank you. Are you going to hold them? I can do that for you. Thank you. I'd like to start by asking this question of Clive Lewis to begin with. As a former grammar school pupil who hasn't come from a privileged background, I would be interested to hear what the thoughts of each candidate has on the proposals to reintroduce schools of this type again.
Okay, let's start with Clive then.
I think one of the main arguments that people use about bringing back grammar schools is that it led to an increase in social mobility. But I think what people misunderstand is that it also coincided with a time when this country was one of the most equal countries in the Western world, and actually there were opportunities through the welfare state, through public sector, for people to be able to progress. And the other side of the stated position of the Conservative Party on reintroducing grammar schools is, well, there's two parts to it. The first is that what they don't say is, if you have grammar schools, you're also probably going to have secondary moderns or their equivalent. And if you remember, though, this is where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children were basically given a second-rate education compared to children who went to grammar schools, kind of written off at the age of 11. What we're saying in the Labour Party, quite clearly, is that we want to ensure that all of our children benefit from a good, decent, comprehensive education. And we don't want to see our society segregated any further. And that means, ultimately, not taking money from the schools budget to pay for grammar schools. I think it will be to the detriment of the vast majority of children in this country. We've seen far too much division in this country over the last 30, 35 years. We think it's time now to begin to heal those wounds. And going down the route of grammar schools, I'm afraid, isn't the answer.
Richard Bearman, what's your view on grammar schools?
Well, I'm of the age to remember when we did have the 11 plus, and I actually took it. And
Did you pass?
It. I did actually, yes. But I chose not to go to a grammar school. There was even in the 60s then, there was the option of technical colleges, which is where I went. And it was much, much better suited to my academic background. Mind you, they also have bike sheds and girls, which made a huge difference. So it was a very important part of my teenage education. But regarding grammar schools in Norfolk, even Chloe Smith agrees that it's not an appropriate structure for the Norfolk education system. In fact, we know very well, I've sat on children's services at the County Council for 8 years, and we know very well what is possible in schools' achievement. And Norfolk attainment and achievement of Norfolk children has grown dramatically over the last 3 years, and that's because it's not changing the school to an academy. It's not giving them a fancy new uniform. It's not spending millions on new building. It's appointing an excellent head teacher. It's appointing good staff and having that school rooted in their local community where everybody goes to their local primary school and to their local secondary school, and they get good results and go on to university if they want to. But they don't have to go on to university. I think there's much more can be done with technical and vocational education that does not require academic pursuits. There's too much emphasis these days on purely academic attainment. We've got to look at a much more holistic and balanced curriculum, and the phrase broad and balanced curriculum was used frequently when I first got into education as a governor, but now it's a very narrow, focused curriculum, maths, science and English.
Okay, I want to ask Lana Hempsall. I want to ask, Lana, what do you make of this grammar schools policy? Are you supportive of it?
I have to admit that I came from, obviously I wasn't educated here because I grew up abroad, and I did attend a selective secondary school which worked for me. So coming into England and being confronted with the concept of a grammar school and all the historic hang-ups that we have as a society in relation to grammar schools is a learning curve, and I'm very aware and mindful of, the historic connotations with grammar schools, and I view the introduction of grammar schools with that caution.
Theresa May has apparently set aside £50 million of funding towards it. Is that a good use of funding?
Complete waste of money. What do you think we could do with £50 million in education that's so much better?
Let's ask Lana. What do you make of that?
I suspect that talking to a few other, MPs, I'm not entirely convinced we're all sold on the idea of grammar schools, especially not in Norfolk. And I would like to think that, we can find.
So it's in the manifesto, but it may not go through.
Well, Chloe's already expressed her reservations. We've worked really hard in Norfolk to bring the schools up to scratch. I was just talking today to somebody who, whose daughter is now the new head teacher at Acle Academy, which did go into special measures. And on a personal level, I think there's there's better ways locally, especially with the animosity against grammar schools.
Let's bring James Wright in here. What do you think?
Well, I think there is a particularly sort of nostalgic view of grammar schools when people are talking about them now. But let's be very clear. The evidence suggests that social mobility is not improved by children who go to grammar schools. Children in grammar schools on free school meals significantly different from that in mainstream education. I myself am a product of one of Norwich's comprehensive schools, and I think we must continue to make sure that schools are properly funded, stop tinkering around the edges, bring back local authority, accountability and involvement in the schooling system, and make sure that we're funding schools properly and giving teachers the pay that they deserve for the work that they do.
Let's go to Rob and have another question from the audience.
Yeah, let's take one from Facebook. We're getting all sorts. There's plenty of you watching. There's some rather odd questions coming in about you all singing a rendition of PJ and Duncan, which we'll refrain from doing at the moment. We'll instead take a question on pensions. And there's plenty of ladies talking on our Facebook about from the WASPI group. And these are ladies of a generation that say their pension age has been put back and they're left out of pocket. Is that a problem? How do we solve it?
OK, should we start with Richard?
Yes, my pension age is being put back as well, actually. But the pension age put back was something that was brought in 2006 under the big pension reform. So it's 11 years ago that was planned to come in. Now, the government has been quite clear about putting the pension age back. I don't think it's necessarily a fair thing to do, but if they're going to balance the books on pensions, and they're not going to balance it any other way, and people are living longer, we've got to do something. I think what it is down to is individuals have got to look at their own pension situation and say, I've been contributing to the state pension this much. I can get a very easy prediction from the Social Security website as to how much it will be. Is that going to be enough to live on? And I would say the answer for a lot of people is probably going to be no. And do something about it while you still can, while you're working. I think people do want to work longer, some of them, but I don't think we should put ourselves in a situation where people are compelled to work longer.
All right, thank you. Let's ask Clive Lewis.
I went to see the WASPI women today in the city centre. They're very angry. I've met them before, and I understand why they're angry. They feel that the state, the system, has robbed them of an entitlement that they've paid into, and that the tables have been turned on them literally at the last minute. Many of them didn't know that this was going to happen. And what Labour is saying is that we will ensure, this is a short-term solution, that we extend pension credit to those most in need who find themselves caught short by this awful situation. But I think it kind of belies a wider situation within society where we have to ask ourselves, I know Richard said that we should perhaps individually take stock of where we are and if necessary while working sort our pensions out. But if you understand that for the vast number of people in our society, in our economy, their real wages are falling, their ability to save is reducing. So actually, people's ability to individually save for their pensions more and more because the state is moving back more and more isn't there. So I think what we have to think about is how do we as a society and as an economy come together collectively to ensure we have the pensions that we deserve after working all our lives. And I think the story of one nurse who came up to me today and said that she has a sister on her ward who is in her 60s and can't retire now until she's 66, 67, who's walking across the ward on sticks. She told me that she was in her 60s. She says, when you've been nursing for 45 years, it's a physically demanding job. I will not be able to work until I'm 67. This is wrong. And I think they speak for a lot of people.
Okay, let's ask Lana. What do you make of this pension situation? Is there anything we can do to help these people?
I came across the predecessor to the WASPI group in the 2015 election, and I was really touched by what has happened to them, and I have pledged my support to help them in Parliament. That's my absolute pledge, because I just think it's wrong. My mother literally fell out of that category, when she retired, and I think I've pledged my support to them, and my heart goes out to them and their plight at the moment.
Richard says we all need to plan for our future and do what's affordable, and I was surprised to hear that from the Green Party. I thought that might be something that you might say to us, Lana.
I would love to say something along those lines, but between our mortgage and all our other expenses, You know, I have to admit, we're not putting money aside for a pension because we can't afford to. Mm-hmm. So it's not as easy as people might portray it to be. So
Okay.
I wasn't suggesting it was easy. I was just saying if you look at the figures, it's something that everybody needs to be much more aware of.
Okay.
And I agree with certain hardship circumstances. We do need to be as generous as possible. But if you are going to guarantee these pensions for the people who fall into this, how are you going to fund it, Lana?
Lana, would you like to respond? How would it be funded?
How are the government going to fund the gap that these people need to fill their pensions?
We haven't got that far to addressing that problem. I've said that I've pledged to support the WASPy ladies because I feel that what has happened to them is not equitable, is not just, and we'll have to hammer it out, with other MPs in Parliament how best to address their problem.
I haven't heard from James yet on pensions.
Just on this particular issue of the WASPy women, Richard said that when the changes were first announced, I think you said in 2006, the government was very clear. Part of the problem with this particular set of circumstances is that it's acknowledged that the government wasn't clear and these people didn't get enough advance notice of the arrangements that were going to come in. And so and I, for one, would like to make sure there are more transitional arrangements in place to sort of ease the plight.
And Clive's talked about that as well. So let's move on and have another question. Rob's got some more for us.
OK, let's take one from the audience, and Ian Gwyn's got a question for us on foreign policy.
Thank you. Do you think overseas military action will make our country more or less safe?
OK, will overseas action in military action make our country more or less safe? You used to be defence spokesman, didn't you? Why don't you tell us what you think, first of all, Clive?
Thank you, Claire. I think it all depends on the circumstances and the caveats that go with that. I think one of the things we're learning, increasingly understanding, is that the war on terror isn't working. And I would say that the world is a less safe place since 9/11 than it is now. And so, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over. Now, I'm not a pacifist. I've served in the army. I've served in Afghanistan. I've seen some of the people who have been committing or trying to commit the atrocities around the globe and in this country. I've seen them face to face. And I understand that at some point, as many people in the army also understood, you will not win this war on terror simply by military action. And I think what we're saying is, when it comes to military action, there needs to be a broader strategy. It can't just be about dropping bombs on people from great heights or invading countries and then leaving failed states where terror and terrorists can begin to prosper and plan. What you need to do is you need to have what I would call defence in depth, which is about talking about how do you cut off the supply to terrorism, which isn't just about cutting off arms, it's about stopping poverty, ignorance and injustice. If we can do that with better trade, better health, better education, stop interfering in other countries' governments when we don't like them, stop taking people's resources unfairly, then I think if you do that, then you begin to see that we can have a fairer world. And the last thing to say really is that time is ticking down, because I think, we've seen it this week. Climate change is upon us. There is a massive chunk of the ice sheet in Antarctica that's breaking off. The world is warming up at a rapid rate of knots. And we understand that climate change is going to have a massive impact on our world, on crops, on societies, on democracies. And I think if we don't sort that out, if we don't get that right, then what we're seeing in Syria and what we're seeing around the world with refugees will just be a taste of things to come.
OK, let's hear from James on this.
Thank you. We certainly need to significantly change the approach that we have to military action overseas. I think there has been a case in the past where it would certainly appear to someone like me, and I take a view that military action, there's a very high bar to launching any form of action. In 2003, I was there protesting against the Iraq War. I think that was a poor decision on the part of Tony Blair, and I still think that all those years on, and Charles Kennedy, our former leader, was vindicated. So in exceptional circumstances, but clearly we must do more to ensure that overseas aid is there, as Clive has suggested, to make sure that people are not put in a position of feeling that that we have these failed states, essentially.
OK, Lana, the question was, do you think overseas military action makes us more or less safe? What do you think?
I think that we need to take a firm stance on terror as Theresa May has outlined, it's not okay to condone terror attacks. It's not okay to apologise for them, as we've heard from the Labour leader. It's not okay. When we as a country intervene abroad, it's usually at the invitation of the country whose rebel forces are struggling, like they are in Syria, against Daesh, which is killing its own citizens, and that's when we were asked to step in. Now, whether dropping bombs, airstrikes is the right way forward, long term, is probably up for discussion that, our military should have, in terms of forming that strategy. I'm seriously unqualified to make that, that judgment call. And that's where I want to leave it.
Okay.
We can't apologise for it. It's not right.
A brief response from Clive.
On that, I don't remember the invite to Iraq.
No, I think, to challenge that slur, I think everyone that heard Jeremy Corbyn's speech was quite clear. The person responsible for Manchester or for any terrorist atrocities, the person that pulls the trigger, that detonates the bomb or does whatever they do, they are the person ultimately responsible. But as even Boris Johnson understands, and two former heads of MI5, you cannot take out of the equation when you look at the very complex reasons for why or what motivates terrorism, what can be behind it. You cannot take out foreign policy. That's not me saying that, that's Stella Rimington, that's various generals, various people, including Boris Johnson, your foreign secretary, that have said that. And Jeremy Corbyn wasn't doing anything of the sort of making apologies for terrorists. He wasn't doing that.
Okay, let's hear from Richard Bearman. Thank you.
Clive touched on a very important point about the ability of other nations and other countries to grow their own food and look after themselves and feed themselves. And with runaway climate change and global warming leading to more and more deserts being created across the world, it's driving migration of all sorts. Now, the migration we have now is causing problems to the Western world, to Western Europe. Think how much worse that would be if we're fighting over water supplies, which is what's going to happen in the future if we don't change something in the climate. It's very sad to see people driven out of their homes unnecessarily. I'm not enough of a military strategist, and I listen to what Clive says, the Shadow Defence Force, and about whether we're in a safer world or not. It feels much less safe to me than it was when I was younger.
All right, lovely, thank you. Let's go back to Rob with the audience.
Yeah, well, let's see what Ian made of that. Ian, you asked the question. Are you satisfied with that?
Thank you. The bit that I would question is, Clive, you speak about Jeremy Corbyn and his attitude, and also Diane Abbott. The fact that Diane Abbott felt that, yes, it was in the past, but she felt that the IRA should succeed and that the British state should fail, and that MI5 and MI6 would be a good idea if they weren't around. And Jeremy Corbyn spoke about the fact that when the Falklands were invaded, that we should have sat down and talked first and let the Argentinians get a better stronghold on the Falkland Islands. I think it just says to me about more deep-rooted feelings that perhaps stopping and talking, which I think is important, but sometimes you do need to step in to say who's boss. Perhaps a bit like when you're talking about going to Donald Trump, you criticised Theresa May for talking and you wanted firmer action, but it seems, that you contradict yourself.
No, I don't think it's a contradiction. If I just come back to that, I think just very quickly, look, you want to dredge up the past, and that's fine. Let's dredge up the past if you want. David Cameron wanted to see Nelson Mandela hanged as a terrorist. If you want to go back a little bit further, I can talk about other things that Tory politicians have said which are quite odious in terms of race relations. But what we want to do, and I think what the Labour Party wants to do, we want to look to the future. We want to look to the future of this country and the future of the world. If you want to rake up the past, much of it, like the campaign that you're running on Facebook at the moment, which is a half-truth, alternative facts, if you want to call them, be polite. Lies might be the other name that you call some of the ads being put out by Conservative Central Office about what Jeremy Corbyn is meant to have said. The reality is the negativity that is being fired at Jeremy Corbyn, I don't think, is working. You can look at the polls, you can look at public opinion, you can knock on the doorstep in Norwich. People aren't listening to it anymore. They're tired of it because they can see through why you're doing it. And I think ultimately, yes, let's crack on with what's being debated today and for the future.
Okay, thank you, Clive. Let's go back to Rob. He's got another question for us in the audience.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's move on to a new topic. Let's move on to Brexit. We haven't heard enough about Brexit yet. We've got a question from Erland.
Should the final decision on accepting the Brexit deal or remaining be made by politicians or by the voters?
All right, thank you very much, Erlen. Let's start with James Wright. Who should make that final decision on Brexit?
The voters should. On the 23rd of June last year, we began the process of starting to leave the European Union. That then has to be something that's negotiated by the government, Theresa May, and maybe David Davis, perhaps the clown in chief in the form of Boris Johnson. I'm not sure who that will end up being, but they will negotiate that, and they will come back with a negotiated deal. And at that point, once they have a deal, that should then be put to the British public. Do you like the deal? In which case, vote yes. If you don't like the deal, no, and we remain in the European Union at that point.
But some people will say, we've had the referendum. We've had the referendum, it's done, the decision's made. Why not just get on with it?
The decision was made to leave, but on that ballot paper, there was nothing about under what terms we'd be leaving. We saw a bus driving around saying there'd be an extra £350 million a week for the NHS. Is that coming? I don't see it coming. No one was clear whether that meant leaving the single market. Did it mean leaving the customs union? Would there still be freedom of movement? All of those questions were left hanging in the air. All people talked about was the sort of EU bureaucracy. Well, let's go out, let's negotiate a deal, and let's put it to the British public so that they can have their say. I trust the people. I trust in democracy.
Right, thank you. Let's ask Lana, what do you think? Who should make that final decision?
I don't disagree with James. I trust the British people, and I trust in democracy, and I think democracy is a fantastic idea. But what James is suggesting is rubbish. Because
why is it rubbish?
Because if you have a simple question on the ballot paper that says, do you want to leave the EU, leave or remain, that's a decision that the British people made. The majority of them decided that we wanted to leave. Now, if you start throwing in, do you like this deal? Does the deal have 1 point? Does it have 2 points? Does it have 100 points? Do you disagree with one of those points, 2 of them, 3? Do we have a sliding scale of disagreement? I just think that, what James is asking for is noble, but it's unworkable, and that's why we elect people to make these decisions on our behalf. That's why we put our faith in our elected representatives, and if we don't like what they decide, their neck is up, at the ballot paper.
Okay, quick response from James, and then we'll come to Richard and Clive.
But this is a monumental decision. We've already put it to the public once, so let's put the end product to the public.
But unworkable. She says it's unworkable.
Well, I don't think it is unworkable, because there will be a deal, and unlike the referendum on the 23rd of June last year, where we had a series of competing groups who all put their vision of what leaving the EU meant, this will be a negotiated deal that goes to the public.
All right, Richard Bearman.
Yeah, the Green Party view is similar to Lib Dems, that the people should decide on the final shape of the deal, whether or not they accept the deal. However, like James, I'm still waiting for this bus with £350 million on the side to come along, but I am hoping that, like First, when they does come, 3 of them will come at once.
All right, thank you. Clive, what's your view?
I listened to Lana then, and that people elect representatives to make the decision. Well, that would have been nice, but Theresa May denied Parliament an opportunity to have a meaningful vote on the final outcome. Now, the whole point of the referendum was so-called to take back control. To who? And at the moment, that control isn't with your elected representatives, it's with some of your elected representatives, the executive, the government. That's wrong. And up until Article...
Unless it's a Labour government,
Up until Article 50... No, and actually, you're wrong there, because I'll explain what I'm going to say. Up until Article 50, I actually hoped that Theresa May would allow Parliament, the Conservatives would allow Parliament to have a meaningful vote on behalf of the people as your representatives on that outcome. But they haven't. They've denied us that. All those amendments were thrown out. And so I now come to the conclusion that actually, if you actually want to give people a real say, then there should be a referendum on the deal that comes back. It's not a second referendum. We've left the EU. That vote has happened. But I think most people understand that when David Cameron set up the referendum, he assumed that he was going to win. But if he hadn't, he would have ensured that there was at least a second part to the referendum, or a minimum threshold of 60% or 70% of people. He didn't do that, and I think it's really critically important that the people of this country have a say in one of the most important decisions we will make this century.
I want to ask another question in a minute. Just a quick response from Lana. You were laughing there. Why?
Well, yeah, I'm laughing because this comes from a Labour candidate who's Tony Blair signed the Lisbon Treaty on our behalf and didn't ask anybody if it was okay to do that, apart from his executive. And I'm quite, amused as well that he's praising David Cameron.
I have my differences with Tony Blair on occasion.
Sorry. The negotiations will start a few weeks after this election. Who's the best person to conduct those negotiations?
I think the top team of the Labour Party, including Jeremy Corbyn, are by far the best team. Of course, and anyone that disagrees with that will see at the ballot box. But look, ultimately, I think Theresa May, if you can find her, she called this general election to basically say, give me the mandate, and didn't turn up for it. Jeremy Corbyn, I think, has exceeded most people's expectations. He's come out fighting, and he's shown actually that someone who will listen to people, engage with people. And I think actually when we go into Europe, what the Conservative Party have done is they have made themselves the laughing stock, an isolated old man of Europe. And when they go into those negotiations with Europe, we have very few friends in there. And I think actually we could do with a new government, a new mandate, who can get the best deal for this country when it comes to Brexit.
James, would you trust Theresa May to do a good job of these negotiations?
Absolutely not, no.
Why's that?
Well, from what we've seen in the last few days of failure to turn up to broadcast debates, radio interviews, we gather that she's refused to come along and do any network or BBC local. If this is somebody who's not turning up to debate when she's called an election, how will that resonate with the other 27 member states when it comes to negotiating with her? I think she must be seen as a laughingstock in mainland Europe at the moment.
Well, I'd want to pick Caroline Lucas. I think she'd be a first-class negotiator for us.
Let's go back to Rob. Let's have another question.
Should we see what the audience made of that first? There are a few comments going on over here. Gent, I think there might be a Brexiteer or two amongst us. What did you make of those?
Well, I wasn't. I actually voted to stay. But I've accepted the situation. But what seems to be happening now is that, well, we had one vote. Let's keep voting until we get the result that we want. You, and you. Not what actually the people have decided. That's what's come across loud and clear.
All right, thank you, Mr. Proctor, Local Council Leader.
Is that the case then? Are we just voting until we get it right, or what we want, Clive?
No, I think there's a basic issue of democratic engagement, democracy. And what we did when we had the referendum was we mixed plebiscite democracy with representative democracy. And I think what's quite clear now is when you had the referendum result to leave the EU, it was a binary decision. Do you want to stay in? Do you want to leave? But now we can see, now we're leaving, what should have happened is that there should have been a second question there, which was, do you want this deal or not? And I think it's quite clear. No, what Theresa May says that she's interpreting the will of the British people about what Brexit looks like. But when that vote was there, no one thought that it would mean the breakup of the union. No one thought it would mean leaving the single market. No one thought it would mean rolling out of Europe on a hard Brexit. Not even into WTO rules. We don't go into those because the schedules are European, the EU. So, look, I think this is a big issue, and I think we shouldn't be hoodwinked with this rubbish about no deal is better than a bad deal. Of course she's going to accept the deal because she will accept the deal because she understands it's necessary.
And let's hear from Lana. Do you have faith in Theresa May that she can do a good job, get a good deal out of Europe?
Of course I do, because Theresa May has the personal confidence to understand that Europe cannot do without us. Ultimately, at some point, they may be cross at the moment, they may be upset, they may not like the decision that we've made, but I was talking to David Campbell-Bannerman this afternoon, and he said, well, most MEPs are taking the pragmatic view that this was our decision, and this is where we're going, and ultimately we're going to have to work together, because otherwise, our economies will not function unless we trade with each other. There will not be no deal. There will be a deal at some point when, once we can find the common terms of negotiating the deal.
A brief word from Richard.
It's not only about trade and economy, though. It's about the environmental protection legislation, the employment rights legislation that's come down from the European Union. We need to see that legislation enshrined in the British system. Otherwise, we're going to have an exploitative country like America, where big companies can exploit workers and do exactly what they like, and I don't want to see that.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Let's go back to Rob.
Yeah, we've got another question in the audience here. Mystery question from the back.
Okay, so this is mostly addressed to Lana on the basis of what you just said, where you said you didn't think a second referendum was workable on the basis that the deal is complex. Well, every government issue is complex. The previous referendum was complex. What I'm hearing as a voter is that you're saying that I'm not clever enough to know whether what I should decide on this decision or not.
All right, thank you very much. Lana, Is he not clever enough to decide on a complex decision like a second referendum?
I think if we rewind the tape, you'll find that that's not what I said. I'm just saying that the decision to leave the EU was a binary one, and what James is suggesting, if I'm understanding him correctly, if I'm clever enough for that, is that, you know, the final referendum will be, again, binary, but on a deal that will have several hundred points. What's it supposed to look like? Because I can't imagine it. And that's what I'm saying. You know, if you as an individual dislike 10 out of the 100 points, is that still good enough? Or do you need to dislike more than 50% of the points to vote against it? You know, how does that work? Or is it just
James.
the one?
Let's ask James. How could it work then in practice?
It's like any choice that you make in life. You make an assessment of it, and I would like to trust the public to make that assessment.
What could the second question be, though?
Well, the second question would be, here is the deal. I mean, clearly that you couldn't fit the deal on the ballot paper, but there would be an appropriate campaign of educating people what that deal looks like without having all of the different groups putting their different views. So, do you take the deal or not? And if you say you don't want to take the deal, then you maintain the status quo, which is to retain our membership in the European Union, which is probably the best thing this country's ever done, joining that in the first place.
I'd agree. I think I always go for the status quo. They were the best band I ever saw at college.
All right, let's take another question. We'll move on to another topic, I think.
I'm very much enjoying the Richard Bearman comedy gig. I think we should stick with the one-man show. No, we'll take another question.
It's been a revelation, this election. It really has.
We've got a question from Penny Chun.
Hello. Having worked with refugees from abroad and seeing the compassion, care and heart of ordinary people here in the UK to welcome and care for them, I would like to ask each of the candidates, how many refugees per year will your party allow into this country, and how will you support and care for them so that they can feel safe, start to heal and become happy and contributing members of our society?
OK, let's go back to Richard Bearman. How many refugees would the Green Party like to welcome to the UK?
I don't want to put a number on it. It's not a question of numbers. It's having the correct process in place for people applying for refugee status, and if they meet the criteria that we set for refugee status, we accept them. And if they don't, for whatever reason, whether it be security reasons, economic reasons, or whatever reasons there are, but we have a process in place. I've met a number of refugees who've settled here in Norwich, and they're working, contributing to the economy. Some of them are struggling with the language, but there are good organisations in place to help them, Bridge Plus and Refugee Plus, which I've supported, and I think we ought to look at these people as individuals and individual circumstances, not a group as numbers.
But voters often like numbers. They like to know how many people are coming in, and one of the Tory targets, for instance, is to get immigration down into the tens of thousands, and maybe that's a concern for some voters. Do you accept that?
Maybe it is. I think it's a concern when too many people with a different cultural identity live in one particular place. What I'd like to see is much more integration of people when they come to this country. And in fact, the people who've been here 20 years, the migrants here, are the best people to help settle the new migrants when they come.
Okay, thank you. Let's ask Lana, how many refugees should we be accepting, and how would they best settle in?
I was just listening to Richard, and to my mind, there's a distinction between migrants and immigration and refugees. You know, refugees are people who are fleeing a conflict situation in their own country for a limited period of time, and then tend to wish to repatriate. And from somebody who's worked with, refugees from the Srebrenica disaster, and the massacre of 8,000 men and boys, helping the women and the daughters and the people who were left behind after that massacre. It's difficult for me to discuss that subject with a degree of objectivity, because I know how tough it can be for people affected by war.
Okay, let's ask James Wright.
Well, I will give a figure, and I'll give a figure of 3,000 children properly implementing the Dubs Amendment to make sure that those children are able to come over here. And that's something that's failed to happen thus far. I think there's, thinking about my childhood, where I went to school with the son of a Ugandan Asian who was thrown out of Uganda by Idi Amin, and the real sort of sense of purpose that family had, and integrating itself in the community. And so I see the United Kingdom supporting refugees not only as a moral imperative. We have a moral imperative to do it. But actually, people will come here and make their homes in the United Kingdom and make us a richer place. As a city, we have a history of supporting refugees, going back to the strangers that we all know of.
Mm-hmm. Am I allowed to come in just slightly?
Just
I mean,
briefly, if you would.
Yeah, I have a personal story to tell on that, anecdote, if you like. On the way back from Cambridge, I had to be taxied home because the train was cancelled, etc. And my driver was an unaccompanied refugee child, now adult in this country. He got pushed from foster home to the point where his only qualification is his driving license and his arm and legs worth of criminal record. So I'm concerned with bringing over to the UK thousands of children without absolutely be rock solid certain that they're going to be looked after properly and not end up radicalised that this young man I met then became.
A quick word from James.
Well, clearly, as part of that, there needs to be proper funding for local authorities to look after these vulnerable people as they're coming into our communities, whether that be through for funding education, for supporting them with housing needs, etc. So that must all come as part and parcel of that package.
Okay, we've got a lot of things to talk about. Just a brief word,
Very
Clive,
briefly,
if you would.
tens of millions of refugees in this world. Most of them are looked after by the poorest countries in the world. I think you wouldn't want to put a figure on it because you don't know how many people you're going to need to take in. But I think quite clearly, how you treat refugees is a sign of the degree of civilization that you have within your society. And simply put, I think it comes on a need-by-need basis. I know that leadership can also be about having a welcoming, open and tolerant approach to refugees and making sure that you have the facilities and resources to look after them as well.
Okay.
Germany can do it, we can do it too.
Okay, Rob, let's have another question, shall we?
Yes, we've got a question here from Kate Campbell. Here you go, Kate.
Hello. My question and interest is in the role of tactical voting. Is in my interest.
Now we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. My question and interest is in the role of tactical voting in the future of our democracy. More specifically, perhaps, and helpfully, perhaps I can ask: do the candidates agree that tactical voting, as espoused by the Progressive Alliance, is likely to strengthen the hold of the two largest parties, thus reducing the likelihood of ever having proportional representation? And perhaps thinking a bit more broadly about the issue.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with James. Tactical voting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. In a nutshell, I think yes, the current system is, and the current tactical voting that's happening at this election, I think will have an unintended consequence. I gather that the reason for doing it is to make sure that we keep the Tories out, and that's something that I'm very comfortable with supporting, but I think that the unintended consequence of that will be to potentially write off some of the smaller parties and return us to a two-party system, which, as you suggest, will then mean that there is no desire for electoral reform in the future. We have in our manifesto a commitment to bringing in proportional representation at both local and so single transferable vote at both local and Westminster elections, which is something clearly I want to see happen, and and seems to be what those espousing a Progressive Alliance are suggesting, but I have a feeling and a very real worry that that will not happen because of exactly what's being done for this election.
Richard Bearman, your leader's talking a lot about Progressive Alliance. What do you think?
Well, yes, that's right. She has been talking a lot about it. The trouble is it's all one-way talk at the moment. There's very little recompense on it. However, I think tactical voting, the problem with tactical voting is you never get the person you really want. You always get somebody less than that. And I think there is a real danger with pushing more and more votes onto the big parties. They end up looking very similar if you go back in political history. The policies that have been brought in by the Conservatives and brought in by Labour, you can't tell the difference between them. What you need is a diversity of views so you can vote for different things and vote for what you believe in. And I think that's really important to stick to that principle and campaign for the proportional representation. Fairer votes is what we need. If you get 1 million votes, you need the proportional number of seats to go with it. And the system under the MEP voting, the list system that we had in the East, was quite fair in that regard. And we need something similar to that for all elections.
Okay, let's ask Lana Hempsall. What do you think about the idea that it would just reduce the likelihood of ever having proportional representation?
I actually spoke to one of James's supporters on the doorstep the other day who exalted the virtues of proportional representation, and I was there quite a while he tried to explain how it was going to work. And I still didn't quite understand. I still don't quite understand how you then get a local person, who is beheld to the local community if you have that sort of list of people that you then cut off at a certain level. Anyway, apparently it can work, but I couldn't quite see it. I'm going to take lead from Therese Coffey, who is one of my colleagues, and she said that she sits on a significant majority, but she told me that at the last election, none of her opposition candidates lost their deposit, and she said that that's a really healthy place to be, because we need difference of opinion. We are not all the same. We do not all subscribe to the same ideology.
There are lots of Conservatives already in Norfolk. Why do we need another one?
That's a really good question, as in me, because I will work as part of the wider Norfolk team, Claire, to bring, the investment, the jobs, the investment in the NHS, and thanks for that opportunity for that speech. I want to work as part of the wider Norfolk team, and I think it's easier for somebody on the inside to have those conversations than if you're playing party politics in Westminster.
Let's ask Clive.
I can see why tactical voting has such appeal at this election. I think it's because there's such an abject fear of a Tory landslide at the election, and I think that's what's driven people to think about tactical voting, because we're forced to through the first past the post system dominated by two political parties. But I would say, as someone who believes in proportional representation, and there are different models of proportional representation which can balance in different proportions the proportionality of the vote and also the constituency link with the outcome of the result. And I think we can look at those, and that's obviously a conversation for another time. But on the issue of tactical voting and Progressive Alliance, what I would say is that Progressive Alliance isn't just about tactical voting. It's also about working out how can parties, progressive political parties, engage not just with their own voters and work better together, but also begin to engage with the millions of people who don't vote at the moment, who feel that politics isn't for them. And we're all failing collectively to engage with them. Okay. So how can we do that? Because at the moment, I think it's quite outrageous that the Conservatives can win and win elections with just a fifth of the population voting for them. I just
want another quick word from James and Richard. James first.
Although not specifically regarding this election, from a sort of progressive alliance, we have one of those that works informally already on Norwich City Council. We've got the Liberal Democrats, minority opposition, the Greens and Labour controlling the council, but on many issues we are in agreement for most of the time. And I think that is something you learn in local government about how to work in cooperation with people of other political stripes to get what's best for your particular area.
A quick word from Richard, and then we must wrap up.
That's not what my Green councillors say on City Council, but anyway, what I was going to say was I challenged Labour and the Lib Dems. We don't need to have had this election in the first place. In the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, their MPs could have stopped it happening, and we wouldn't have been having this stupid election where we might get a Tory landslide.
Against
all right, thank you very much. We're almost out of time. I want to ask all the candidates to tell us in about 30 seconds or so why you should vote for them. Let's start with Clive Lewis. Why should we vote for you?
I think because Norwich needs, especially in these politically turbulent times, a strong independent voice. I've proven that. I've resigned from the Shadow Cabinet over something which I felt many people in this city felt strongly about. It's something I felt strongly about. But also I think because our manifesto offers people something which I think is in very short supply at the moment, and that's hope, an alternative way of living our lives, of having an economy that works for the many and not just a few. And that's what voting for Labour and Clive Lewis on June the 8th will mean.
Okay. James Wright, 30 seconds. Why should we vote for you?
Thank you. Well, I've got a lifelong commitment to the city. I'm also independently minded, but our manifesto brings with it, we've talked already about having a referendum or a vote on the final deal, looking at putting a penny on income tax for NHS and care, an additional £7 billion a year into schools, and getting the country building houses again, making sure that those developers that are land banking are doing their job. So a vote for James Wright and a vote for the Liberal Democrats is a vote to take Norwich forward.
Okay, thank you. Lana Hempsall, 30 seconds or so. Why should we vote for you?
I think that Norwich South should make a decision to vote for a positive change in Norwich South and vote Conservative. Vote for a strong leader and for a strong government that can see us through the next few years through Brexit and beyond. So vote Conservative, vote Lana Hempsall.
Thank you. And Richard Bearman, your pitch to the voters.
I've been on the county council for 8 years fighting for things like better air quality for the city, better public transport. I want to translate into the national level to do that, and I would work alongside Caroline Lucas to do those things, bring in votes at 16, try and bring in proportional representation voting, but certainly influence the government in the way it treats local government as much as I can possibly do. If you want an alternative voice in politics in Norwich South on June the 8th, vote for the Green Party and vote for what you believe in.
Okay, thank you all very much. It's been a really, really interesting debate. Thank you to all my guests. Thank you to the audience here at the offices of the EDP in Norwich. But that is all we've got time for this evening. Good night.